From the historic campus of Hillsdale College in Hillsdale, Michigan, where the good, the true, and the beautiful are taught, nurtured, and honored, this is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, bringing the activity and education of the college to listeners across the country.
I mean, this is sort of the irony of the whole situation, is that for a society that purports to care about minorities and lower income families, what we end up doing with these lockdowns and school closures is harm particularly those populations.
This is your host, Scot Bertram. That's Dr. Scott Atlas, co-author of COVID Lessons Learned, a retrospective after 4 years, a report published by the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. And we'll take an in-depth look at that report today with Dr. Atlas. He's a fellow at Hillsdale College's Academy for Science and Freedom, the Robert Wesson Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution, and as I mentioned, co-author of the new report, COVID Lessons Learned. Dr. Atlas, thanks so much for joining us. I want to begin by asking about the overall response, particularly from public officials, from government. Did the response from federal and many state governments inadvertently feed into a sense of panic in the public?
Yeah, the overall flaw was that it disregarded standard pandemic management known for, say, 15 years, well understood ways to deal with viral respiratory pandemics, because it was known that lockdowns and closures of schools, et cetera, not only do not work, but are extraordinarily harmful. And because of the implemented lockdowns that disregarded the evidence on this pandemic even, it induced significant fear in the public that spiraled into even more harms and ultimately has led to a loss of trust in public health and other expert level guidance.
Come back and talk about the public trust in a few minutes. One of the major weapons used by government were various stages of lockdowns. Based on the research that you've seen and what's inside this report, COVID Lessons Learned, did lockdowns in any way help to reduce deaths or stop the spread of COVID?
Not significantly, no. I mean, in the reality, the best way to think of this is that the all-cause deaths, which is really the only way to look at death, because that includes death from the viral respiratory infection, as well as the policies and everything else that happened, including loss of medical care, shutting down the healthcare delivery for serious illnesses. The all-cause deaths by country in the world, Sweden did the best. And this is a country that did not do these significant lockdowns that most other countries did. They took a lot of heat for basically trusting the public, giving the information, and assuming that people that have some common sense and would be, restricting their own activity if they were personally at high risk, but they avoided the harms of closing, of forcing people indoors where the cases spread. Unfortunately, we failed to also protect the people who were known to be high risk, including, by the way, I don't want to sugarcoat this, but Sweden failed to protect the people in their nursing homes. But the bottom line is that the lockdowns and the school closures induced more harm than any kind of small potential benefit that they gave.
These negative consequences of lockdowns and social isolation, there's a phrase in the report that I had not heard before, lockdown unemployment shock. And it says that lockdown unemployment shock is projected to result in around 1 million excess deaths over the next 15 to 20 years. What exactly does that mean?
Well, I mean, this is one of the best illustrations of the harms, really, because people can understand this, that when you have, this has been known for decades, that when you have significant economic downturn and particularly unemployment, people die. It's not just an economic issue. It's a health issue. And how do people die? Well, I mean, there's documented data in the literature for decades that their increase in suicide, increase in alcoholism, and by the way, increase in other harms, including spousal abuse, sexual abuse, child abuse. These are things that happen. This is the reality that people don't want to talk about when you have significant economic downturns and unemployment. And the study that you're referring to is one of many, but this specific study was published in the National Bureau of Economic Research that estimated that over 1 million deaths will occur over the next 15 to 20 years, and having a disproportionate impact on women and minorities. I mean, this is sort of the irony of the whole situation, is that for a society that purports to care about minorities and lower income families, what we end up doing with these lockdowns and school closures is harm particularly those populations. Because it turns out, and this is common sense, but we all know it's true from the data as well, that higher income families, the affluent groups, they can work around these kinds of closures far better than people who are lower income earners and single parent families, et cetera.
Talking with Dr. Scott Atlas, co-author on the recent report, COVID Lessons Learned, a Retrospective After 4 Years. Shutting down schools, keeping children at home, and then in some areas, in many areas certainly, keeping it on remote learning for months or even years into COVID. What did we find as the consequences of those choices on our children?
Well, again, we found severe harms, and particularly worse among lower income families, kids in lower income families. What we find is that the learning losses for children are staggering. In fact, they're the largest learning losses in the history of studies that record learning losses from missing school. And the economic losses are therefore impacted in a significant way. By one estimate, the children of today will lose approximately $17 trillion in lifetime earnings due to the school closings. These school closings and lack of education and lack of income, they compound on each other and include a shorter life expectancy, because life expectancy is linked to income and educational attainment. I think people don't want to think about these things because it's such a heinous abuse of really what we view ourselves as, which is an ethical society with sort of a social contract that we prioritize our children. And in fact, this was particularly, heinous and inexcusable because it was known from the earliest days of spring 2020 that healthy children had a vanishingly small risk, a minuscule risk of a serious illness from COVID. That's point number one. And the irony of point number two is that virtually all children in the United States have now been infected with COVID at some point during this pandemic. And so despite all these extraordinarily harmful measures of closing schools, et cetera, they got infected anyway. And so, I mean, this whole thing really is a bit of a fiasco because, as we put it in our written piece, like a regressive tax, these harms were more severe for lower income kids.
We'll continue with Dr. Scott Atlas in just a second about his recent report that he co-authored, COVID Lessons Learned, a Retrospective After 4 Years. First, I want to tell you about Imprimis, and perhaps a recent Imprimis issue that is of interest to you. The December 2023 edition is Senator Rand Paul talking about lessons from the great COVID cover-up. That kind of information is why Hillsdale's Digest of Liberty Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, you can find speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events in Imprimis. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Senator Rand Paul, Heather McDonald, and also Chris Rufo. Right now, more than 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free, and I urge you to sign up for it today, at no charge, of course. For your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Get your free lifetime subscription to Imprimis at hillsdale.edu/lifetime. Talking with Dr. Scott Atlas, co-author of the recent report, COVID Lessons Learned, a retrospective after 4 years, also a fellow at Hillsdale College's Academy for Science and Freedom. We discussed the lockdowns. The other main lever that was pulled through most of the pandemic was the idea that masking could stop the spread. Based on what we know now and the studies that have been done, were masks of any use, any evidence that masking was helpful, that it's helped slow the spread of COVID?
No. I mean, it's very simple to answer the question. The answer is an emphatic no. And we're not just talking about cloth masks or some kind of scarf wrapped on it. We're talking about surgical masks. We're talking about the data, not sort of an intuitive feel. The fact is that this was known by spring of 2020. The CDC had published all the studies, randomized clinical trials en masse for viral respiratory infections that are similar to COVID, and that is influenza, the same relative size of a virus particle as COVID. It spreads sort of the same way. And the bottom line is there's no evidence that masking protects the wearer or slows the spread to other people in the community. And this was proven over and over again by looking at the data in studies of locations where they actually did use masking significantly, including the countries of Asia. But also the studies were done, good studies were done, published in November 2020 from Denmark, and several studies afterwards, including the review of all the data published in 2023 by the Cochrane Review, which showed two things: that surgical masks there's no evidence surgical masks work to stop the spread of the infection or protect people. And the second part, by the way, is that there's N95 masks did not do anything different from surgical masks. So again, people are, by human nature, wedded to what they had believed in. And of course, it was viewed as a way individuals could protect themselves and protect others. But the reality is what we need to work with as an objective society. We need to be a fact-based society. Masks do not work for these viral respiratory infections. That's proven. It's not really debatable, yet there are people who refuse to accept fact.
And by the way, people who would include the CDC, correct, to continue to recommend masking.
Yeah, some of the stuff is inexplicable. I mean, we see people, again, I have to believe that people are just simply unable. It's sort of like cognitive dissonance. They're unable to accept the fact that they were so wrong on something they were so strident about. And the protective way to deal with that as a flawed human being is to just, I guess, continue to assert something that flies in the face of all factual data. It's sad, but it's also, it's harmful. And I think this is something people don't understand. It's not just no big deal. If you want to carry a lucky penny in your pocket, that's fine. But the reality is masking has also been shown to be harmful. First of all, it's harmful to young children to learn language and speech. That should be obvious. But secondly, it gave a false sense of security to people who were at high risk, to pretend that they're protected by some kind of piece of cloth over their face. And third, we have done some kind of an incalculable damage psychologically on young people to believe that evidence doesn't matter, but also that there's somehow a lot of danger out there that you can protect yourselves from with this cloth. I mean, I think history will look very unkindly eventually at people who keep asserting that this kind of stuff works when it's counter to all scientific data.
Dr. Scott Atlas with us here on the show, co-author of the recent report, COVID Lessons Learned, a Retrospective After 4 Years. Early on during COVID, we heard stories of overcrowded hospitals. We heard stories of lack of ventilators, and at some point those stories seemed to simply go away. What ended up being the real story regarding hospitals and hospital utilization during COVID?
Well, the real story was that the hospitals were underutilized. The real story, particularly in the United States, while there were, some examples of hospitals that were crowded, the reality was that the number of staffed beds, meaning occupied beds, steadily declined during the pandemic. And that's partly because people were afraid of coming into hospitals. And when I say afraid of coming into hospitals for non-COVID illness, I'm talking about people, a 40-50% decrease in calling ambulances for acute stroke and heart attack. We're talking about people who skipped their chemotherapy, who had a known diagnosis of cancer. We're talking about people who delayed bringing their children into emergency rooms, all because they were told that these medical facilities are highly dangerous because of COVID. It ended up that a lot of hospitals actually closed, went out of business because they were understaffed. These extra beds and extra non-hospital-based medical facilities were not used. Again, in the beginning, that may have been understandable because of the panic, but eventually you have to look at the facts, and they ended up killing people. They, the people who caused this fear, they, the people who invoked these assertions, they killed people because they shut down medical care for very, very serious illnesses. And I think, again, this is going to be a long time before we can dig out from the hole that was created.
What would be your takeaway and the takeaway from this panel of COVID Lessons Learned on the eventual consequences, or what we ended up with Project Warp Speed, this desire and ability to quickly create a vaccine that was rolled out very quickly after COVID, but then how that transpired the 2-3 years after that? What would be the lessons you learned from that?
Yes, I think that Operation Warp Speed has mixed reviews. There were some very positive impacts. That is, Operation Warp Speed showed how to eliminate unnecessary delays and bureaucracies and how to de-risk innovation to accelerate innovation. And that was actually delivered both with things like monoclonal antibody treatments that were effective when they came out in 2020 and 2021 for the most lethal form of the virus, by the way. And yes, vaccines were developed in record time, and I think that's a positive. Of course, there are many negatives. First of all, for whatever reason, and I think despite the deregulation, there was a prioritization of developing new complicated drugs and vaccines when at the same time the NIH and the FDA should have conducted easily doable trials of low-cost, already FDA-approved drugs that had a biological mechanism of action that indicated that they might work. And instead of doing that, they pushed new drug development, which I think was an incorrect prioritization. Secondly, although the vaccines were a deregulatory triumph, I think you should really say, and in 2020, when the virus was very lethal, the early development of vaccines was a reasonable priority. However, there were safety issues that were not transparent in the assessment of these vaccines. The public was not given full information on the limits of the efficacy, the effectiveness of the vaccines. They were really incompletely informed, and so you had new drugs that were incompletely assessed in terms of safety, that were pushed out and with limited effectiveness, and the public was incompletely informed. I think this was, again, another nail in the coffin of trust in public health guidance, because without the transparency, people need information. And instead of being given the information, there was a tremendous push to just accept these vaccinations as if everyone needed it when everyone didn't need it. And moreover, they were mandated to take them. And I think there were some very harmful impacts of the push to get rapid vaccines out to protect people. So even though I think we should say these things are all well intended, but I think this is the purpose of looking at this is to learn the lessons for what not to do and what did work.
Final question for Dr. Scott Atlas as we talk about COVID lessons learned, a retrospective after 4 years. This report published by the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. This final conclusion in the report says that we should limit government emergency powers and earn back the public trust. This could take a while. The CDC, the government burned through lots of goodwill through the COVID years. How can they take those first steps, if they want, to rebuilding trust with the public?
Yes, I think this is really the key question because we know we are going to have other emergencies. And, we as a very diverse, very large society, we need as regular people to be able to trust the so-called experts. And this issue is really the legacy of people that pushed lockdowns and mandates and school closures that were contrary to the scientific evidence, contrary to logic, and contrary to what was known and then mandating these things. So we need, first of all, to put some limits on the powers of these sorts of moves. We need a clearer definition of public health emergency with strict time limit. Yet the Biden administration pushed declaration of public health emergency 2 years later, which doesn't really sort of make sense. We need to be able to limit what is an emergency and define it. We need to get some independent-minded people involved. And what do I mean by that? We need to have more non-government employed experts at the table to advise and inform the public. We need to make sure that scientific research funding is decentralized. We need to allow for people to explore the scientific process, which necessarily means debating the data fully. We need to eliminate what we saw shockingly and what we still see, which is censorship of information. What we must do as a society is, a free society, is to make sure that people get the information and are informed rather than view the government and government agencies as persuasion is their role. We need information, not persuasion. We need more transparency of the discussions of the agencies like the FDA, the CDC, and the NIH. I don't understand how in a free society the government isn't fully transparent with what is said when they work for the public. We need to make sure that the CDC, the FDA, the NIH are advisory agencies. They do not have power to set laws or mandates. And while that is true, it was abused during the pandemic, partly because we don't have courageous ethical leaders in place who felt more comfortable hiding behind CDC as if the CDC is in charge. When the CDC is not in charge, we need the public to understand that. And I think one of the other things that's very important is the role of international third-party organizations, particularly the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization, in good hands, is very important to get data out there to the public, to issue reasonable guidelines, to help undeveloped and underdeveloped countries that need resources. But we can't have the WHO take on an authority. We cannot delegate authority. We are a sovereign country. They were a failure in the pandemic and, in fact, showed a lot of corruption, frankly, because they said that China was transparent, a model for transparency, even when China was blocking the WHO from looking at the Wuhan lab. Mm-hmm. They did all kinds of things that are really unacceptable, particularly the US is the #1 funding country of the World Health Organization. So we need to take a step back here, make sure that the WHO and these other agencies, including our own really, are cleaned up. We need to have a lot more accountability and transparency and get good people into place so that, free countries, free individuals are really the ones who benefit rather than are ruled by these government and non-governmental organizations.
Dr. Scott Atlas, Fellow at Hillsdale College's Academy for Science and Freedom. Robert Wesson, Senior Fellow in Healthcare Policy at the Hoover Institution. Also co-author of this recent report, COVID Lessons Learned, a Retrospective After 4 Years, published by the Committee to Unleash Prosperity. You could also find an excerpt over at the Wall Street Journal. Dr. Atlas, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thank you for having me.
Up next, we talk with John Daniel Davidson. He is the author of the brand new book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. I'm Scot Bertram. This is the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Hey there! Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back to the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. I'm Scot Bertram. Be sure to check out the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. It's at podcast.hillsdale.edu. We're joined by John Daniel Davidson. He is senior editor at the Federalist, also a Hillsdale College alum, class of '04. And he is the author of the brand new book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. John, thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Scott.
Very early on in Pagan America, in the introduction, in fact, you say, as Christianity fades in America, so too will our system of government, our civil society, and all our rights and freedoms, which seems like a lot of stuff, all tied together. Why is Christianity and the country, as we know it, so inextricably linked?
Yeah, well, the argument I make at the outset of the book is that America, despite all of our talk these days about a wall of separation between church and state, America was really founded as a Christian country. That is to say, the founders understood that in order to have a republican form of government, in order to have self-government and the structure of government that we have, you needed to have a moral and religious people, that is to say, a predominantly Christian people. They weren't talking about Islam when they talked about a moral and religious people. They were talking about Christianity. And indeed, that's what we had at the time of the founding and what we have had for most of our history. And I think it's pretty clear when you look at what the founders said about what they believed they were doing, that they knew that you can only have this kind of society and this form of government with a people who are thoroughly shaped and a public square that is thoroughly informed and molded by Christian moral virtue, and indeed a Christian sort of cosmological vision of man and society and how we should order ourselves as a polity.
Early on, too, to the title of the book, Pagan America, I look and I see this semi-definition. No fixed system or belief or set of solid convictions ought to constrain us as we stumble our way through life, and that power alone determines what is right. In those words, I hear echoes of this discussion these days, or argument these days, that it's my truth. It's
Yes.
There's nothing you have to rely on other than what you yourself want or what you yourself believe about yourself or about things around you. in those ways, are we already seeing some of this pagan America that you discuss come to fruition?
Yes, indeed. The argument here is that the pagan America described in the book is emerging now, and the seeds of it were planted some time ago. And what I mean by the pagan ethos can be summed up in the single line: nothing is true, everything is permitted. And that's the kind of radical subjectivity that we see today across a whole host of debates about public policy and in our culture wars, from the transgender debate to the abortion debate to critical race theory and our debates about race and identity. In each case, we see the assertion of a person's individual subjective truth or subjective reality over and against objective truth or objective reality. And a Christian worldview, a Christian civilization posits transcendent, objective moral truths about human nature and about how society should be organized. And the pagan worldview or the pagan cosmology is not just the opposite of that, but the inversion of it. And we see this throughout pre-Christian pagan societies. And I argue that as America becomes more and more post-Christian, we are reverting to the pagan ethos, and that ethos is going to present itself in new forms for a modern or postmodern age, right? We're not going to have temples to Zeus and Apollo popping up in Times Square, but our society will be fundamentally pagan, despite not having maybe some of these pre-Christian pagan forms that we kind of associate popularly in our minds with paganism.
John Daniel Davidson with us, his book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. If we try to pinpoint when some of these changes began to occur, you put a little lasso around this pre-World War II era and a specific Supreme Court decision. What's happening around that time, and how does the Supreme Court play a role in what's happened over the past century or so?
Yeah, this is the 1940 case, the Cantwell case, where the Supreme Court ruled that a state cannot distinguish between a religious cause and a non-religious cause. In other words, a state can't even take cognizance of what is a religion or what isn't a religious cause. And this, they said, was a violation of the Establishment Clause in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, that the government cannot make a law establishing a religion. But this was a radical departure from how the Supreme Court and indeed American society at large had understood the Establishment Clause from the founding. And it was a rupture with how we had understood the role of religion in American public life up to that point. Previous religious liberty cases were sort of decided on a case-by-case basis with sort of an analysis of the competing interests and claims, but there was never this presumption that the government had no ability and no competency to recognize a religion, and that public policy could indeed be informed by religious considerations, and that churches and affiliated church institutions could engage in public policy and could participate fully in the public square. All that began to change after Cantwell, with a series of Supreme Court cases that came sort of rolling in over the next couple decades. And this is how we got the cases in going from the 1940s through the 1960s and 70s of banning prayer in public school, banning Bible reading in public schools, and all these things that everybody is really more familiar with. But I argue that it represented a shift, and it wasn't a shift that was just reflected in the Supreme Court, but in American society at large, where this narrative took hold that there had to be this wall of separation between the church and state. And I argue that was really a misunderstanding, not only of what Jefferson meant by that phrase, but what the founders themselves generally thought. After all, one of the first acts of the first Congress, before the First Amendment was even ratified, was to appropriate public money for a Christian chaplain for Congress. So that's the sort of thing that the court in Cantwell in the 1940s would have said was a clear establishment of religion. But the men who wrote it during the founding era clearly did not think so.
The Decline of Christianity, as you explain it, the atrophy of faith inside pagan America. As I read this section, I could not help but think about the lessons inadvertently learned via the pandemic about school, when unions essentially told everyone in the country school's optional, school's not that important, we can close it for a while.
Yeah.
Did churches behave in the same manner? And I know this trend goes back a bit farther, but it has accelerated. Can we blame churches? Do at least some churches have similar blame, and that people have learned an unfortunate lesson that maybe it's not essential, maybe we don't need it?
Oh, churches deserve a lot of blame. And I talk about that in the book, that as the quantity of Christians decreases in America, so too has the quality of Christian teaching and the practice of the Christian faith, such that you have, huge swaths of Christians now across all denominations affirming things that are clearly not Christian, that violate basic small o Christian orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. And the different denominations are guilty, in different ways, depending on their biases and their predispositions. But we do see this. You can track a decline in the quality of Christian faith, sort of parallel to a decline in the total number of Christians. And undoubtedly, during the pandemic, we saw Christian leaders just sort of like roll over and accept the line and accept the narrative of the secular authorities. Even the premise that, the secular authority can declare some businesses or some activities essential and others non-essential. This was a moment where Christian leaders should have stood up and asserted their parallel spiritual authority next to the secular political authority. Especially I think of Catholic bishops, since the Catholic Church is more hierarchical and formally hierarchical in a way that the Protestant churches are not. Mm-hmm. This was an opportunity for Catholic bishops to say to mayors and to governors, you do what you need to do, for in the area where you have competency and authority, and we will do what we need to do in the area where we have competency and authority. But instead, they just sort of rolled over. And unfortunately, I do think that it reinforced the message, which we've been getting for generations now, that the formal practice of the Christian faith and the religiosity of people out in the public square and influencing our lives, our communal lives together as a people, isn't really that important, and that religion can just be a private thing that's restricted, just to a single person, but also inside the home. And that's never been the understanding previously that Christians have had, certainly not in America up until very recently.
John Daniel Davidson with us. Pagan America is the book, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. There's an entire chapter on the rise of the materialist magician, a reference to C.S. Lewis and Screwtape Letters. For people who are not familiar, what is the materialist magician, and how does it fit into what's happened in the country recently?
Yeah, one of the central arguments of the book is that the idea that, the Enlightenment and the secular age were going to usher in sort of a post-Christian future that would be coldly rationalistic, coldly materialistic. It would be a kind of secular liberal utopia where religion wouldn't have the same purchase that it did in the past. And I argue that this is totally wrong, that notion of the future as this atheist secular utopia is just a way station. It was just a temporary illusion that the post-Christian era is still going to be religious. It's just not going to be Christian. And what we're seeing now, I think, and what I try to document in the book, is the emergence of an openness to the supernatural and a kind of re-enchanting of the world that's taking place alongside this sort of strict materialist mindset that rejects the claims of traditional religions, which is why you see a rise in the number of people who are saying that they are spiritual but not religious, right? And the materialist magician is a brilliant phrase that C.S. Lewis came up with in the Screwtape Letters to describe this sort of person, a person who considered themselves a skeptic and a materialist, and so their mind was closed to belief in God, but they were open to spiritual forces and even to a kind of willingness to listen to spiritual beings and explore spiritual mysteries, and that, in the case of the Screw Tape Letters, the demon who is saying this, who is saying that we hope to create this new man, this materialist magician, if we can create this sort of person, then the end of the war, that is the war against God, will be in sight. And I argue that we're seeing this materialist magician, this amalgam of secular materialism and belief or openness to the supernatural and spiritualism. We're seeing that emerge now.
Section on abortion and euthanasia in Pagan America. And so many of us, maybe not us, but so many do say, I'd never do X. I'd never get an abortion. But I don't want to impose my beliefs or my values on others. It's one of the problems in Pagan America that we don't say that more often, that we don't do that more often, that we don't impose our beliefs, we don't impose our values on others more often.
Yeah, absolutely. And I describe abortion and euthanasia as human sacrifice in the new pagan cults. And the reason I say that is because, like sacrifice in the pre-Christian world, in the pagan world before Christianity, sacrifice is sort of this, human sacrifice was this communal thing that happened formally to appease the gods, but it was something that everybody had to be on board with. There were these atrocities that were committed, and if you had anyone who dissented from that, who said this is not right, then the horribleness of it, the barbarity of it, was sort of exposed. So everyone had to be on board, and it was necessary to kind of deny the humanity of the people who were being sacrificed, and that's what we see with the abortion debate, and with the euthanasia debate too. That's emerging now. That's sort of catching up to it. And one of the things that I talk about is how the justifications for abortion specifically have changed since Roe versus Wade. Mm-hmm. It began as sort of a denial of the humanity, a straightforward denial that these unborn children are not people. There's just a clump of cells. It's no different than getting an appendectomy, and it's no big deal. And as medical technology advanced, that justification had to change. And in the 90s, we saw a new justification, this notion of safe, legal, and rare, that while unfortunate, abortion was necessary to vindicate the rights of women. But now we've dispensed with all pretense that this is anything other than the taking of a human life, and it's justified based on the will of the mother. And that's what determines whether or not the unborn child gets to live or can be killed with impunity. It's not really about gestational age or our scientific knowledge of in-uterine development or anything like that. It's simply based on the exercise of power by the powerful over the weak. And that is characteristic and classic pagan thought applied in the modern world.
Yes, it brings together two of the themes in the book. One, that the powerful get to decide what is right and what rights we have or what rights the unborn have. And this idea, too, that of the denial of humanity. I think about some of the current discussions and arguments, John, and this new scientific breakthroughs, viability moving earlier and earlier, the ability for us to know when a baby feels pain. Those arguments, which in a Christian nation you might expect to move opinions or move the line, doesn't seem to do so, doesn't seem to move the needle much in this debate. Are you surprised by that? Not really, because one of the characteristics of the pagan mindset is that it doesn't need to cohere, right? We're as Christians and as people who grew up in predominantly Christian societies and have a Christian history, we're used to everything kind of cohering, right? Faith and reason go together. They complement one another. And there's a kind of internal consistency and logic to it. But when your cosmology is based on force and coercion alone, you don't have that same kind of coherence. And so, one of the things I document throughout the book is the kind of corruption of reason that we're seeing in the post-Christian era, and the disfigurement of reason and a disregard for actual scientific truth. The irony is that the progressive and post-Christian left, which I talk a lot about in the book, they invoke science all the time, that we follow the science and we believe the science.
but they don't really actually care about science at all. And they're really willing to discard any scientific findings or any kind of facts that contradict or get in the way of what is fundamentally a pagan mindset that might makes right. And so we should not expect post-Christian pagan America to cohere or arguments that are based on reason and science to win the day, because we're past that now. After all, science itself and the scientific method are creations of Christian civilization. And increasingly, we're not living in a Christian civilization anymore. We're living in a pagan one.
Just a couple of minutes left with John Daniel Davidson, his new book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. Toward the end, you say we need to have the courage to take back our towns and with bold, brave acts that assert Christian truth. So what does that look like in practice, John?
The first thing it means is finding ground that you can fight and win on, right? You're not going to be able to win in every part of the country, but Christians need to think hard about where they live and consider uprooting and moving to places where they can join together other Christian communities and churches and schools and neighborhoods and take back their local city council, take back their local library, take back their school district or their school board. We've seen this, especially coming out of the pandemic that we talked about earlier, once parents realized in some cases what their kids were being taught or that they weren't being taught in the local public schools, a kind of pushback from parents, that they're wanting to get involved and take over these school boards. Christians need to do that on a large scale all over the country. And I say that because, we should build our churches and our homeschools and protect our families and build up thick communities, but Christianity can't be relegated to the purely private. It needs to be out in the public square, proclaimed for the whole community and be visible to the whole community. And that's how it was for most of our history. That's how it was for most of the history of Christianity. The idea that our faith and our Christian religion is a purely private matter is a totally recent invention and totally false. So Christians need to wrap their minds around that and start thinking about ways that they can bring their faith back into the public square and assert Christian claims about our humanity and our common life together over and against the emerging paganism of our time.
And very quickly, John, I think in the read of the book, and particularly toward the end, is it safe to say you think that this is a more immediate threat, or at least we are farther down the line than perhaps others who are having similar thoughts and conversations might think?
I think we're much further down the line than most people realize. And part of my motivation for writing the book wasn't to offer like a 10-step plan to save America. I don't think that that's possible right now. This is a generational struggle. But my motivation was just to get Americans, and especially Christians, to wrap their minds around this fact that we are living in a post-Christian time and indeed a pagan time. And the first step to fighting back and winning back our civilization is to accept the reality. And so that's really one of the main purposes for Pagan America.
John Daniel Davidson, senior editor at The Federalist, a Hillsdale graduate, class of 2004, and the brand new book, Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. John, thanks so much for joining us on the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.
Thanks for having me, Scott. Appreciate it.
That will wrap up this edition of the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour. Our thanks to Dr. Scott Atlas, co-author of the recent report, COVID Lessons Learned, a retrospective after 4 years, and John Daniel Davidson. He's the author of Pagan America, The Decline of Christianity and the Dark Age to Come. The Radio Free Hillsdale Hour is recorded at the studios of WRFH, the student-run radio station at Hillsdale College. Remember, you can hear new episodes every week on this station. You also can find extended versions of some of our interviews or listen anytime to the podcast. Find it at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio. The assistant producer of the program is Sam Lair. Until next week, I'm Scot Bertram, and this has been the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour.